Welcome back to Arguing with the Internet. In today's episode, we're considering the question, should we have empathy for everyone? Now, if you're not familiar with the show, what we do here is we find arguments on the internet, people talking about this topic, and we try to dissect the good arguments from the bad arguments and try to figure out the best way to think about this issue. With that, I think you had the first internet argument for us, Matt.
Yep. This one, per usual, comes from Reddit. Um, so this person is asking a question, but within the question, they've got a bit of an argument themselves as well. Uh, the question: why would someone have empathy for people who do bad things that hurt other people? Is there a benefit I am missing about empathy for bad people? Why should I feel empathy towards drug addicts or murderers? Am I missing something? I feel like the people who empathize with these awful humans are just trying to give themselves credit as enablers. We all make choices. I'm saying that my energy and effort to put myself into someone's shoes is not warranted by those who continually make bad choices or choices that harm others. I seriously would like to understand. Okay, so he's got a bit of an argument there, but before we jump in, we'll introduce the second and then come back. So the reply is because one of the most important steps to stopping people from doing bad things in the future is to understand why people do bad things. So pretty short and sweet reply here.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into it, let's return, I think, to the question. The idea is basically just that perhaps we should not be empathetic to everyone. Why? Because some people have done heinous things, and it's not worth, in this person's words, to expend our energy and effort to put ourselves in their shoes because it's not warranted. These people have hurt other people, right? Sometimes in very serious ways. Why would you
Right.
want to be empathetic with them?
No, I think this is it's an interesting argument, and it gets into I think something we should talk about is different types of empathy and
Hmm.
or a definition of empathy because people use this term in different ways. And so, the second the second commenter might be pointing to what's called cognitive empathy. So the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes to understand someone else's perspective. But they could also be talking about emotional or affective empathy, which is actually feeling what someone else is feeling. So if you see
Hmm.
someone suffering, you might, see someone who's sad, you might feel sad as well. And they're two different, people use them interchangeably, but they do mean two very different things. And so
Right.
I think the response to this, why you should care about these people who do bad things, it could be on the cognitive angle. Just if you put yourself in someone else's shoes or try to understand their experience, that can give you insights into why the person acts this way, and maybe you could prevent things like this happening in the future if you understand the
Hmm.
causes of these sorts of actions.
Right. So when we're talking about empathy, there's a distinction to be made between actually feeling as someone else does and merely being able to conceive of the way in which someone else feels, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the difference between actually sharing the feelings and being able to, to imagine how it must be for them given their perspective, right? Something like that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so perhaps the commenter, the person responding to the question, is arguing that, well, at least this form of empathy is useful, right? Understanding why these people have done what they've done requires us to understand, maybe in part, um, how they feel. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we ought to try and feel the way that they do. Something like
Right.
that.
Yeah, they could be making that case too. I mean, it's a pretty short response,
Sure.
so you don't know exactly what they're thinking, but yeah, I mean, there is that question of the differences between emotional and cognitive empathy and their function. So you could think of someone as being like a cold, calculating,
Hmm.
robot almost that like feels cognitive empathy in the sense that they understand how other people um like what they feel or why they do things, what they believe, that understand their experiences, but maybe they can't feel what other people are feeling. Like, is that sufficient to like is that all you need for
Right.
empathy, or do you actually need that
Right.
emotional component to sort of feel what other people feel? Is that something that adds value to
Right.
taking someone's perspective?
Further question related. to what you've just said. Might it be necessary for us to do the feeling as someone else does to actually understand why they've done something, right?
Hmm.
Is it possible for us to understand why someone has done what they have without actually knowing how they felt at the time? Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the right answer to that is. But what we're getting out of this first uh, post is that it seems like, at least to some people, maybe it's not worth empathizing with some because of what they've done, right? It's some people, in other words, aren't worthy of being empathized with. Um, so this notion of worth, I think, is an interesting one, right? Like, who is worthy of empathy and who isn't? Um, Maybe in some cases, like the ones, or at least some of the ones that this person mentions, like murderers, cold-blooded killers, right? Maybe many people would agree. Oh, yeah, it doesn't seem like it's worth empathizing with this person. But I'm not sure it's going to be universally the case for all people you might typically cast aspersions upon. For example, in the posting, this person says that they don't feel as though they should have empathy towards drug addicts. I
Mm.
think there's a lot of room to think that drug addicts are in tragic situations, that they do
Right.
deserve some compassion or empathy. Um, right? It doesn't seem like they've necessarily done anything dramatically harmful to anyone else. Um, so I'm not sure that this. I'm not sure how we would settle this issue of worth. Right? Who is worth having? Who is worthy of having our empathy, and who isn't? And I don't think
Right.
all cases are going to be as clear cut as like an obvious cold blooded murder.
Yeah, I mean, they're painting with a pretty broad brush here. I mean, yeah, like you said, drug addicts. I don't know. Like, I mean, people do judge drug addicts, but you could like it's weird to put them in the same category as like murderers
Hmm.
because you can definitely understand, especially with like the opioid crisis,
Yeah.
other, the crack epidemic of the '80s. I mean, there's like
Yeah.
there are a lot of people who were getting hooked on drugs, so much so that you can't just think of it as a personal failing, or it's hard to see it as a personal failing when it's happening at such a large scale like
Right.
that. Um, but yeah, I mean, at the same time, like, yeah, there is that question of, you know, should you draw the line somewhere? So, like, a most heinous example might be like someone who abuses children.
Mm.
Um, but an argument you could make is that understanding like why abusers do that behavior could help you prevent it in the future. So people who are abused as children often
Right.
grow up to abuse children when they grow up.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily excuse their behavior. You can still hold them accountable, but to understand why they did that, at least like cognitively to just sort of understand what happened to them
Yeah.
to create that, that could have value for sure.
I think that's what the responder is trying to get at, but um, it seems pretty clear in those cases specifically that what's required there might not like necessarily be empathy. Uh, and we can go about trying to gain some kind of like clinical understanding of someone, like for example, what you mentioned, that abuse kind of begets more abuse, right?
Mm.
This kind of thing can be studied clinically in a very detached kind of way. It doesn't seem necessarily to require that we feel empathy for the perpetrator in order to understand why it's being carried out. Perhaps empathy would be required to understand how strongly the perpetrator felt compelled to do these horrible things. And so we can't fully understand the phenomena without some kind of empathy. But if we're just looking at like the causal nature behind the problem behavior, right? It doesn't seem like empathy is strictly speaking necessary.
Right, because you could have like a supercomputer, let's say, that
Mm.
like knew like basically like why everybody does everything, or like why every physical interaction happens. And maybe this isn't possible, like related to our free will episode, like maybe you can't have something like this, but if
Hmm.
there was like a supercomputer powerful enough to sort of know why people did the things they did, like would that supercomputer kind of know, um like is that the same as empathy, sort of just knowing the causal chain of events, so like
Right.
why certain things happen? It's like, is that empathy or is that something different? Like it doesn't
Right.
seem like the way that at least people typically use the term.
I suppose then what you need to get clear on is what your goal is, right? If your goal is to be able to prevent these kinds of happenings, crimes, whatever, in the future, then maybe all you really need to know is what the supercomputer can tell you, right?
Hmm.
These are the things that led up to it. These are the things that all of these kind of events have in common causally, right? So if you want to intervene, you should intervene on this uh, aspect, right? Uh, but if your goal is to maybe understand um, the feelings of the person involved, then you're gonna need something like empathy to do the job. So I guess what we're seeing then from this first post is whether or not that part of empathy everyone is worthy of, right? Whether or not everyone is worthy of us extending ourselves to try to feel as they do, right? To understand how they feel, not just uh, why they do what they do.
Right. No, yeah, there definitely could be benefits to empathy beyond just sort of understanding why someone did their behavior. I
Hmm.
think that's something some of the other arguments we'll get into touch on a little more.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly. Yeah. So, but so far we've gotten interesting distinctions between different conceptions of empathy, right? There seems to be different kinds of empathy. Actually feeling as someone else does and kind of understanding why someone acts the way they do, right? Um,
right.
one of them seems to
Uh,
allow for a more cold, calculated approach, while the other seems to require us to take on a more um, deliberate role in adopting someone else's perspective. Maybe it's not the case that everyone's deserving of that latter kind, but what we're hearing from the reply here is that it might be in our best interest to extend the other kind of empathy more globally, right? It might be
right.
in our best interest to understand why people do what they do. We're going to see more on that, I think, in the next couple of arguments. But I think this one's a good introduction to the problem at large.
Right. Yeah. Let's jump
Do
to
you
the
want to
next
move
one
on?
then.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on.
Yeah. So this one also comes from Reddit, so from the unpopular opinion subreddit. And so this poster says, as a diagnosed psychopath, ASPD, so that's antisocial personality disorder, empathy gets too much credit. Empathy is often regarded as the personality trait that is altruistic and keeps the world from being completely cold and evil. Narcissists, psychopaths, sociopaths, whatever you want to call us, etc., are all regarded as evil because they lack empathy. At its core, empathy is far more selfish trait than sympathy and logic. In order to empathize, it is argued that someone has to be able to actually feel what it is like to be in another person's shoes, meaning they imagine and feel themselves in the position of others. I argue that it takes more kindness to be unable to feel what others feel, but to then still make moral choices that are not self serving, regardless of personal indifference to the plight of others. It is easy to do right by others when you can focus on how you would feel in their stead. It is more difficult and requires more character strength to be able to still do what is considered the morally right thing while using other faculties like sympathy and reason. Yeah, so this person, so you see, that's probably the common description of psychopaths, sociopaths, whatever you want to call them, is
Hmm.
people who don't have empathy, which is probably not correct necessarily given our distinction here. So that like cognitive empathy, being able to understand uh, other people's perspectives, beliefs, that sort of stuff, they do have that. It's really the emotional aspect of it, like
Hmm.
feeling what other people feel, that is diminished. So this person is making the case that they don't have that emotional aspect, and they're sort of that emotional aspect is overrated. At least, like it's not. Well, they're making a couple of different arguments here, but one of them that they're not evil just because they lack
Right.
that, but also that emotional empathy is overblown the importance of it.
Right.
Um,
That it's not as great a strength of character as many people think that it is. That
right,
in fact, acting with other people in regard, so acting well in regards to other people without empathy, they're suggesting, is emblematic of far better character than if you were only doing it because you're a naturally an empathetic person, right?
right, and that's an interesting argument. I mean, some people do make that argument that if you like, I don't know if you're chaste, let's say like it's in your religion, like it's good to
Hmm.
be chaste. Like if you're in an environment, like if you're in a monastery, for instance, and there's no one around uh, for you to break your faith with, like that's not as
Right,
worthy than if you're surrounded by
right.
you know suitors or whatever. Like,
If you don't have the
uh,
opportunity to transgress, you haven't actually shown your devotion to your duty,
right,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, for sure. There are similar lines of thought that run through Kant's work, Immanuel Kant, right, where the notion of doing your moral duty well for Kant would require you to do your duty for duty's sake, not because you're naturally inclined to want to do it. So, for example, if you really, really just love helping old people cross the street when they need it, um, you don't get any credit for that, right? You don't get any moral credit for that. But if you don't love doing it, right? In fact, maybe you despise helping old people across the street, but you do it anyway because you think it's your moral duty, that is praiseworthy, right? That's praiseworthy.
hmm
Why? Because you're doing it for the duty's sake. So similarly, this person is arguing that, well, look, I treat other people well, not because I feel the way they do, or because I pretend to feel the way that they do, but because I express this conscious effort. I am intentionally sympathetic. I use my reason to decide what I'm going to do when it involves other people. Right? I don't just rely on this empathetic process. So they're arguing they should get more credit than other people, more or less, right? Should get more credit.
right, yeah, which is I don't know what the implication of that is. I mean, like on the one hand, it could just be that we should hold psychopaths, people that don't have emotional empathy, if they do have good behavior, if they act morally, we should hold them in a higher regard
Hmm.
than people who do have emotional empathy.
Right.
Uh, but the other implication would be that like we shouldn't have emotional empathy, or it's like somehow a cheating, or like it's a
Right.
cheap way of like if you are moral because it's sort of in your nature, if it's easy to be moral, like that's somehow like cheap. And I don't know if the implication is like we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't have that, or if it's just maybe this person's
Yeah.
kind of like personal grudge, or like they feel
Sure.
that they've people treat them poorly. I mean, they say that like people regard psychopaths as evil,
Hmm.
which certainly if they're feeling like people are judging them like that, then that's understandable.
Yeah, I think there's some good and bad to this post. I think they are right to suggest that the lack of empathy does not necessarily mean that you are in some way a bad person, right? That you
Hmm
are in some way incapable of being moral, right? I do agree that that is true. It doesn't seem like I need to feel exactly the way that you do in order for me to treat you as though you have moral worth, right? Like
hmm
when I go to contribute to charity, for example, that is going to benefit children far across the globe that who I will never meet, have any contact with, uh, who are starving, right? Well, I don't know them. I don't know what kind of life they're living other than that they're in dire circumstances. And I don't know what it's like to starve. I don't have to have those feelings in order to try to help them. Right. So it doesn't seem to be the case that I need to have this kind of emotional, like shared emotional kind of empathy in order to do what's right by someone else. So I think this person is right in suggesting that. But on the other
hmm
hand, I think they're very concerned with diminishing empathy, which I don't necessarily agree with. Because, as they're suggesting, it is the case that if you're empathetic with other people naturally, I think it follows that you'll be more inclined to treat them well, right? If you are naturally more empathetic, you're naturally going to want to consider others when you go to decide what you're going to do, right? Um, does that make it somehow cheaper or easier to do this kind of moral reasoning than if you had to go about it using reason purely? Perhaps, but if what we care about are just the consequences or the effects, right? That other people are taking other people into consideration when deciding what to do, what does it matter, right? Who cares how you get there so long as you do? And if empathy is the easier way to get people there, all the better for it.
Right. That's an interesting point because I think that that might actually be controversial. Like that empathy, emotional empathy, produces a better state of
Hmm.
affairs morally. So like Paul Bloom, a psychologist, argued in the book Against Empathy. The
Yeah,
title is maybe slightly misleading because he's for cognitive empathy but against emotional empathy.
right,
So like against feeling what other people are feeling. Uh, because it can lead you astray and lead you to make moral choices that are not ideal from a consequentialist perspective. So they don't produce
right.
the best, like the greatest good, let's say. So an example would be, you see, uh, you see a child who's like in dire need, let's say, um, and it could be a child in America, you see on the street, or like one of your family members even,
Hmm.
uh, is living in poverty, let's say, or like poor
Hmm.
conditions, like not necessarily life threatening, but like really bad conditions. And so you give that person money in order to improve their circumstance. Uh, you can make the case that that money could have been better spent elsewhere. Like maybe if you gave that same amount of money to someone in a developing country
Oh, I
for
see.
mosquito nets or something
Hmm.
like that, then you could save a life for the same amount of money. You would have just improved
Right.
the condition of life for someone who's closer to you. So maybe like the emotional pull that we feel from things that we see in people close to us can lead us to make decisions that are not producing the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, I think there's room to push back there, though, right? Like, I understand the move, which is to say that, like, if you allow for empathy in this way, you're going to end up over prioritizing those that you have empathy with, right? Which tend to be local to you, right? But you could push back in the defense of empathy by saying, well, this just shows that we haven't been doing enough where empathy is concerned. It doesn't show that empathy is bad at motivating moral behavior. It shows that we actually need to broaden our horizons where empathy is concerned. Actually,
Mm.
do try to be empathetic with that stranger across the world, right? Do try to consider them as like a global family rather than um, some faceless being across the on the other side of the earth, right? And so I think
Right. So,
there's in that, and there's still a way to preserve the empathy
hmm yeah, I think that's because I think it's an interesting point because I mean, people have more empathy or care more about like their family members, let's say, than people like from a
movement.
different country and completely different culture. Um, so that's one aspect of it where you could have more empathy for people that are different from you,
Hmm.
and that could
Hmm.
sort of alleviate that preference. But then there's other situations like, uh, so like the effective altruists, the people that try to you know do the most good. Um, they're basically like utilitarians, like trying to produce the most good, the best, what they call utility. So like, pleasure minus pain, or however you want to define that.
Right.
They'll point to things like, maybe there's things that you can't really empathize with, like there's pollution. Uh, so like if there's like certain, I don't know, things that are like they don't have like a specific victim. So like maybe like pollutants in the air will cause people to die earlier
Yeah.
or have a lower quality of life, but it doesn't
Right.
affect anyone in a really profound way. And so it's like
Hmm.
hard to be moved by that in terms of empathy. You really have to have that
Sure.
kind of cold logic
Sure.
to come to that conclusion. So maybe in that way, empathy can kind of lead us astray.
Well, perhaps, but again, I think there's room to push back because you can say, no, I think that empathy is an important ingredient or perhaps even sufficient for generating moral feeling, um, while it need not be a necessary one, right? So you can get towards productive moral feeling or moral reasoning even in the absence of empathy. Again, I think it would be a mistake to deny that, right? And so
Hmm.
when reasoning about these kinds of harms that are going to be more disparately experienced and not experienced by any one particular individual, thus making it very difficult to try to empathy our way into understanding it, right? Um, yeah, this sounds like an area for reasoning, right? This sounds like an area for calculated reasoning. It does not follow, though, from that empathy is by and large a bad way to go about feeling our way through the moral landscape, right? Um, okay, there are exceptions, sure. That doesn't mean empathy's bad. Um, so I still think there's room to push back here. Now, uh, where you mentioned Bloom, I mean, he has a lot of different arguments against uh, against empathy, right? And one of them is that they can take a toll. Empathy can take a toll on the person empathizing, right? Um, if you actually do go about trying to feel the way that others do, you're going to suffer as a result of that, right? Evidence shows that those who are more empathetic suffer more depression, they suffer more anxiety, right? You're going to suffer as a result of trying to feel the way other people do. It can be taxing. There might also be an upper limit on how much it's possible, right? You might have absorbed too much at some point, right? Further, it might be the case that it's being empathetic with someone isn't always good for them, right? It might be the case, like if I'm in trouble, for example, and I desperately need a solution to get out of the problem I'm in now, it might be that the last thing that I need is for someone to come along and try to feel exactly the same way I do. No, I'm in anguish. I need someone who is in a state of of being more clear-headed at this moment to help me out. That requires a kind of detachment, right? That this kind of shared feeling style of empathy might not provide. Um, those I think are Bloom's stronger arguments at um, trying to drive us away
Right.
from empathy where moral concerns are.
Yeah. Now I want to get. So I want to touch on like the first point you made. So
Yeah.
empathy can cause us distress essentially, and it can in some situations paralyze us. So if we feel too
Hmm.
strongly, like for instance, if you walk by like a homeless person every day, and
Right.
like you feel so bad for that person that like you just change your route, you like walk to a different
Oh,
route so you
sure.
don't have to see them.
Sure.
That's not really solving a problem. Like you feel bad about the problem of homelessness and people
Right.
not having enough, but instead of doing something about it, you just you know avoid that route. Like so empathy isn't really doing anything for you, it's actually detracting.
Right.
um so I think there is, I think that is an aspect of emotional empathy, but I wonder if it's completely tied to that. Like if you, because so there's a uh personality index that psychologists use called the interpersonal reactivity index that they use to
Hmm.
measure empathy. And there's four um, different types of empathy, for like subclasses. So one of them would be perspective taking, which is similar to cognitive empathy, like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. There's empathetic concern, which is being moved by someone's experience, like and wanting to do something to alleviate that. There's like a fantasy element, which is kind of weird. It's like if you're reading like a novel or something, you sort of put yourself into the
Oh, sure.
character's
Hmm.
shoes, sort of like you become part of the story, something like that. And then the other one is personal distress, which is related to what we were talking about,
Hmm.
where you are moved by someone's emotional state, but in a way that is maladaptive, or like it causes you distress.
Yeah.
And those two are not. I mean, So like the empathetic concern and the personal distress are not directly related. So like you can be high on one and low on the other.
Hmm.
And so one of the reasons I read about this because there was this big study for or like this impactful study from like 2010 of looking at college students' empathetic scores and using this index, and they've gone down over time. So from
Okay.
like the late 70s to 2009. And so like the personal distress, that measure did not change, but empathetic concern and perspective taking did go down. So you can have, changes in one without changes in the other. Uh, so yeah, so this was what I wanted to push back on, was like maybe that's not, you can have emotional empathy without having this like bad aspect of it. This two things you can maybe divorce.
Okay, so yet another kind of distinction to be made where empathy is concerned. So are you suggesting then that the distress component might be an overall negative when it comes to moral appraisals?
Well, it's yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if that there is. So I think a little bit could be good. I mean, at least intuitively, being a little bit distressed by someone's suffering could cause you to do something about that, something that's
Hmm.
positive, but it could also cause you to do something that's negative. It really depends on the
Right.
level. So
I
yeah, if you
certainly
have too
understand.
much distress.
I think your example is a good one. I think that if you do experience like a great enough degree of distress, um, you might want to avoid that source of distress in the future, which means you're not really going to be doing anything to help, um, which does seem problematic where moral choice is concerned, right? Um, but I want to think that that only happens when it's not clear what you can do, right? If it seems like there's some course of action you could take, I'm not sure distress leads to that kind of resignation. Um, Perhaps, I'm not sure. On this conversation, people talk about rather than distress caused by empathy, they talk about distress caused by fear and how that can lead to resignation more than they do empathy. But I think the two bodies of literature can kind of merge on this point. The idea is that appeals to fear, for example, like causing you to appreciate how dire a problem is by instigating fear of the problem, can be very good because it helps you recognize the salience of the problem, like how dire the circumstances really are. But if you don't provide some kind of opportunity for resolving the source of fear, it's going to lead towards resignation, which is not good for motivating action. I think we can say the same thing about uh, empathy here, especially distress caused from this kind of shared feeling empathy, right? Um, it could, I think, make some things more salient. It could show you, like, if I try to feel the way you do, I might, in a much greater way, appreciate what you're going through. But if
Hmm.
it's not clear to me how to go about trying to address the problem, I think you're right. It's going to lead towards something like avoidance or just resignation, which in this case would be like despair, right? It's just going to lead to
Hmm.
like unproductive despair. Um, but at the same time, I still think there's something there. There's something about the possibility of empathy making the situation more salient, right? Like I think of, for example, like Emmett Till's mother, her choice
Hmm.
to have her son's funeral open casket, right? That
Right.
choice was very intentional, right? It was to show the nation uh, how she felt, to get them to feel the way she felt by showing them the horrors of racism, right? Her uh her sadness, her disgust at what had happened are things that you feel when you look on the body of Emmett Till, right? And in doing so, the salience, the how dire the situation really is communicated, right? It spurns action, right? It gets us to do something. It motivates us rather than uh, forces us into a position of despair and avoidance, right? So I think it's a fine line, but I do think that empathy does have some potential usefulness. Even when we're talking about empathy in this uh, like shared misery or shared feeling
Hmm.
sense. Yeah.
I think that's a good point because, yeah, I wonder about your example with Emmett Till. So, like,
Mhm.
if you or you, like, I say, if people only had the cognitive empathy, they could only put them, you know, understand sort of logically what other people are going through.
Right.
I don't know if you would get the same kind of
The
cause for action that
forcefulness.
right
Yeah.
that motivate like big societal changes and civil rights or what have you, because I don't know, just sort of understanding the facts is not the same as like really feeling, especially because you can put you can better put yourselves in their shoes because you know you think of like if you had a kid, like what if
Right.
your kid ended up like
Right.
that, and
Precisely.
um it's much more than just sort of thinking about it. And I feel like also with the cognitive aspect, if you're just sort of like looking at it from a cold reason perspective, you could kind of, I feel like you can rationalize a little better. You could say like, well, this is, how often does this really happen? Or like, maybe it's
Hmm.
just a one-off event or, but
Right.
yeah, having the emotional component to it really like brings it home and lets you see these injustices,
Right.
better attend to them.
No, for sure. I think when you take the more like detached approach, you can recognize that it's morally bad, right? That this situation is not a good one. But at the end of the day, if you're not taking this empathetic perspective, well, it's another lynching that happened down south, right? It's just another mark on the tally, right?
Hmm.
Um, but no, it's more than that. Why? Because you're forced to confront it, right? You're forced to confront the reality. You're forced to feel the way that these people do, uh, because because the imagery forces you to, right? Um, so yeah, I don't know. I do think there is a role for this kind of empathy to play. That being said, going back to the purpose of this post that you introduced, I don't think it's strictly speaking necessary for for morality, right? I do agree with this person that you can get there by different paths, right? You can be like a very considerate person in a very careful, rational way, right? I'm choosing each and every time I'm good to someone else to be good for its own sake, not because I feel like you do or anything like that. Not because I recognize that we're in this boat together or that, we share these things. No, because I'm choosing to, right? Fine. You do deserve, some applause or whatever, right? Fine, great. Um, that doesn't mean, however, that someone who reaches that same end because they feel for another person is doing it wrong. I think you can't get that further conclusion out of the first.
Right. If anything, they just are less praiseworthy than the person who
Sure,
doesn't have emotional empathy. But it still
perhaps.
doesn't mean they're doing
Yeah.
something
If
wrong.
you're a consequentialist, it's not even clear that that's the case. But
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. Under some views, it might be the case that you're more praiseworthy if you're just honor bound to being good rather than doing it because you really feel deeply for other people. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should move on to the next one.
Yeah. So this next one is sort of a journey. Uh, it's a it's a post that comes from the subreddit Change My View, which, if you're not familiar, is this place where people post what they regard to be controversial opinions, explain why they have the opinion that they do, and try to elicit responses from the community in an attempt to change their view. Right. Um, so first up, the person who is posting and their own view, and then we'll get to the response. Okay. I've had many conversations with people about horrible people and horrible events. Well, sometimes I've been presented with the why would you ever want to empathize with blank? I don't think that empathy is something we only do to benefit others. We also use it as a tool to improve ourselves and can look at a monster's life and draw lessons and benefit from it, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with that. and it's reactionary to not try to put yourself in someone else's shoes just because they're a terrible person. Um, so, should we discuss this before moving on to the response? Yeah,
Yeah, I think we could start with that. I mean, I think
yeah,
it's an interesting perspective that empathy is, think of it as being other oriented. That's mostly what we've
right,
been talking about, being aware of someone else's plight and doing something to alleviate that. But this person's arguing that it can actually have a benefit for yourself
right,
to empathize with other people, which that's an interesting argument.
right. If you go with a view that the last person, the one that you introduced, was disparaging, where an empathy is a sign of like a virtuous person or something like that, then we can see very clearly why being empathetic to more people is going to benefit you because in some way it increases your virtue, right? But what this person is trying to suggest is something more nuanced than that. That no, actually being empathetic with other people can benefit us from the lessons that we can draw out of doing so, right? It's an interesting idea. I'm not they don't they're not explicit with what they mean by lessons and how we can benefit from them. But I can't help but draw parallels between certain theories of dreaming and this idea of empathy, right?
Hmm.
There's this one notion of I'm sure being a neuroscientist, you know much more about this than me. But there, correct me if I'm wrong, there is this one theory of dreaming that it's like an opportunity for our brains to sort of try out scenarios without actually being in jeopardy, right? You get to try out how you would respond to certain kinds of potentially dangerous stimuli without ever being really exposed to risk. Is that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, that's something I've heard of, for sure. And yeah, that's an interesting idea. Because yeah, I mean, you could. Yeah, I haven't really thought of empathy that way, but yeah, you can imagine that with like reading fiction, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. Like you're
Yes.
exposed to other people's lives who may be very different from you, and maybe you can glean certain insights about your own life that way. Um, but yeah, so again, I'm wondering if it requires the sort of emotional element. So again, we have that distinction
Mm,
between like just sort of understanding someone and also like having emotions invoked in you. Like certainly you can get insight into other people's lives. They're like, oh, they made this choice and now they're a drug addict or whatever. They tried
right.
heroin once and now they're addicted to heroin. Like I'm not
Right.
going to do that. Um, but do you need the emotional element, or does it add something? I guess to have uh, the illicit,
Right.
eliciting emotion by understanding someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a question we kind of keep coming back to. Is the felt emotion necessary to understanding why someone does what they do? Perhaps. It's hard to say one way or the other, but at least when we talk about certain kinds of killings, for example, there is already precedent for this kind of thing, right? Like, um, if you are overcome with feelings of uh, despair or something like that, it might be more understandable that you would commit certain kinds of violence or crime, right? Whereas if you felt nothing at all while you were doing it, it seems like cold blooded, right? In some way, it's worse. Like a crime of passion while still being bad is somehow, at least I think people would agree, uh, less bad than a cold, ruthless killing
Hmm.
for no particular reason whatsoever. So to paint a picture, right? Like the kind of story you hear about, like a woman who finds her husband in bed with another person, right? And decides to kill him, right? We can all accept that that's bad, but it somehow seems less bad, at least to me, than someone like the DC snipers, right, from
Mm.
years ago, where the killings just seem utterly random, right?
Right.
Um, both are bad. One seems worse. And without this kind of like understanding of how one feels, we might not be able to appreciate that distinction.
Hmm. That's interesting. I guess there are multiple ways um, to interpret this. So yeah, I mean, you can have. a better appreciation for what other people are going through to make better assessments about them. But I think you could also make the case that this person's saying that like this makes you a better person by understanding what other people are going through, by feeling other people's emotions. Sort of like the opposite of what we talked about before about like
Hmm.
if you torture animals, even if animals don't matter, like it still makes you a bad person according to some views at least.
Mm,
So maybe the opposite is
right.
true, where if you feel what other people are feeling, even if you don't necessarily do anything for them, like it makes you a better arbiter of moral judgment, or like it just makes you a better person, either through your future actions or just I don't know the
Mm.
way you understand things. It's somehow more moral. I don't know.
Yeah, but returning to this like dream analogy, this explanation of dream analogy that I made earlier, what if it's the case that um, in taking this kind of emotional empathy, wherein you try to share someone's feeling, um, you are sort of asking yourself, well, what would I have done if I felt the same way? Right. So I entered the room and saw my husband in bed with someone else. Uh, she felt this way. So I'm putting myself in her shoes. How would I act? Right. And if you come to the conclusion, oh, I would have done much the same, maybe this is important for
Mm.
making moral decisions, right? Um, yeah, maybe it is important to fully appreciate the emotional content of a situation in order to uh, accurately describe its moral components.
That's interesting because like if we go back to like the supercomputer example, the supercomputer sort of knew all the facts of the case
Hmm.
of when someone murdered their spouse under different circumstances. I don't think it could understand it in the way that a human with emotions and with empathy
Hmm.
could. And so I don't know if they can make the same assessment. Like if and also going back to like the psychopath example, like maybe your moral reasoning isn't the same if you're just going by like the facts and sort of understanding just the basics, like non-emotionally how other people feel. Like maybe there is
Right,
something missing there, and like really having having that personal experience that's similar to the other person, uh, that really does
right.
change your moral assessment. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah, I think
I
that's
mean,
an
you can
interesting
think
point.
of any number of cases like this, right? Like, let a completely fabricated thought experiment, right? You can imagine a parent having to make a terrible choice between saving their own child and saving a stranger's child, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think most of us are going to accept uh, it as permissible that they save their own child, right? Like, um, because we can see that we would do the same, right? We
Hmm.
can sort of empathize, we can put ourselves in their shoes, how they might have felt in such a situation, and for that reason offer them some kind of excuse, right? We can use this kind of empathy to help us in excuse making, right? If I were there feeling the way they felt in that situation, what would I have done, right? um yeah, so I think this person might be onto something, that empathy can allow us to sort of learn more about certain situations than we might without it. But then the person responding to them has some good points as well, right? So should we turn there? No.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not going to read the full thing; it's very long, but I'll note that they're more or less going to argue that there are some ways in which expressing this kind of empathy can go wrong or can be morally problematic. So
Hmm.
I'll jump in right away to their examples. Sometimes people express empathy in the wrong situation, and it is not polite or very caring. For example, if the conversation is about domestic violence victims, it is not the right time or very caring to go, well, the abuser probably had a hard life as well. Or, it must be very difficult to not be able to control your emotions. Uh, because this isn't really the right place for such a thing.
Hmm.
Uh, so I'll stop here before moving to the second one, and we can come back to the second one because there's a lot to say already, right? So I think this is a very strong point that this notion that empathy should be applied universally could occasionally, at the very least, do more harm than good, right? If, for example, in your expression of empathy is at the expense of being unempathetic to someone who does deserve your consideration, maybe it is harmful, right? So in their particular example, uh, being empathetic towards uh, the perpetrator of domestic violence could mean falling out of empathy with their victim, right? It might not be possible for me to at once feel empathy for the perpetrator and at the same time fully feel empathy for the victim, right? That might not be possible. And if it isn't possible, then I think it is a fair claim to make that, well, look, you're failing the victim then. You're failing them.
Mm. Well, there could be, yeah, I don't know. So there could be like two ways that could manifest itself. So you could have, you're speaking with a friend who's a victim of domestic violence, and you empathize with the friend, but also the abuser. Um, and maybe the empathy that you have for the abuser diminishes the empathy that you have with the friend, uh, the victim of abuse. But at the same time, it could just be, the way they word this, it could be just a lack of tact. Like maybe it's fine to have that empathy, that empathetic response to the person who is morally wrong in the situation, but you shouldn't bring it up. That's not a good situation
Sure.
to say like to the abused victim that like, hey, your abuser, like maybe you
Yeah,
should empathize with them too. But if it does interfere with the empathy you should feel for like
exactly.
the more worthy individual, then yeah, that's a separate issue.
Yeah, you're right that this person is going after the tact or the politeness, right? Or an acceptable expression of care, right? Where I'm going after something a bit stronger than that, which is
Hmm.
that as you put it, um, it might not be possible to have full empathy with a victim if you're also sharing that empathy with the perpetrator, right?
Hmm.
Because then you are not feeling necessarily in the way that the victim does. You can't be. You cannot be in principle if you're also feeling in the way that the perpetrator is, right? And so there might be a decision that you have to make just in order to be a decent person, uh, who you should empathize with, right? I don't think it should be the perpetrator if there is a choice to be made here.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there's different degrees of this. Like, given the severity of the moral transgression, maybe that changes the calculus a bit
Hmm.
because you could think of something like less severe where you know you might have a friend who just every time you have a disagreement with someone you tell them about it they're like, oh yeah, you're right, that person's wrong. Like,
Mm,
um they always take your side. um and sometimes that could be nice, it could feel nice, but like it isn't necessarily good for you to like develop as a person because sometimes you are wrong, sometimes we all do
sure.
stupid stuff, and we're the wrong one, or at least we have like things that we could make better in our you know interactions with other people. And so to have a friend who says like, yeah, I see where you're coming from, but maybe you should like give the other person the benefit of the doubt, or try to see it from the other person's perspective, like that can be a good thing. But again, that depends on if it's an abuse situation, like that's that's a very different. So I think it depends on like the
Right.
severity of what you're talking about here.
Right. So I see where you're going, right? Like if you decide to cut off one party from any sort of empathetic response, then you might not understand the full situation, right? And you might not be faithful to the truth of the matter. But like as you also noted, these kinds of discussions kind of go out the window when it's about abuse, right? The most important
Right.
thing in the case of a case of abuse is to uh, get the victim out of the situation, no matter what the true nature of the situation is, right? Your first impulse should be to support the victim. Um,
Right. And it does seem like empathy is like a kind of limited resource where,
mm,
I mean, even if you try to feel empathy for everyone, you're not like almost no one's going to succeed with that. You typically feel the most sympathy for people that are close to you, like family,
sure.
friends, and other people that are similar to you. And so like following this person's argument, maybe yeah, having too much empathy, trying to distribute it too widely
Hmm.
is bad because you don't have enough left over for the people who
Right.
really need it.
Now, one way perhaps of pushing back on this idea, because if that idea holds and the question, should we have empathy for everyone? It seems to be no, right?
Mm.
So, one way of pushing back in order to keep us in suspense, uh, perhaps you could argue something like, well, no, you still ought to have empathy for everyone. It's just that you ought not have empathy for everyone all at the same time, right?
Mm.
So, uh, sure, you're right to argue that your priority is to the victim, right? Your empathy to the victim is of paramount importance, whereas your empathy to the perpetrator is of significantly less importance here and now. But perhaps once the victim has been brought into a more stable state, they're no longer in a position where they can be as adversely affected by your seeking to empathize with the perpetrator. Then perhaps the scale shifts a bit, right, towards it being permissible not for you to stop empathizing with the victim, but to extend a bit more towards the other party, right? But only when certain uh objectives have been completed, right? Like ensuring that the victim is safe, is no longer in danger, uh feel supported, etc., right?
Mhm.
So it's not the case that we get to say no, there's some exceptions, not everyone should be empathized with. Rather, it's just that not everyone should be empathized with all at once, right?
Yeah, so maybe there's a priority of
Right.
you could think of like a priority list of like individuals who you should empathize with,
Right.
and like the people who the abusers, murderers, those people should be like the last tier.
Mm.
Which I don't know. I mean, would you ever get to that point? I mean, if you do have like a hierarchy of empathy, like wouldn't you
Hmm.
like? It seems like it would be hard to like get to that point. Maybe there's another argument I see. Like, sure, we could empathize with Hitler or whoever
Sure. Yeah.
bad person you want to talk about, but like, why not empathize with all the other people, like all of Hitler's
Right.
victims? Uh, at what point would you be done with your empathy and like have some left over for this bad person?
Yeah, at what point are you ever going to get through the backlog of the many, many people who are seemingly more deserving, right?
Yeah,
Especially if we're talking about like the Hitlers of the world, right?
right.
Um, yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, but still, to kind of like wiggle around with the question, it still comes down to there being temporal exceptions, but not in principle exceptions, right? So
Hmm.
the Hitlers of the world, for instance, um, they aren't in this case then in principle exceptions. When you ask, should we extend empathy to everyone? The answer isn't no because Hitler existed, right? The answer is not all at once because extending empathy to Hitler is far less important than extending empathy to those affected by him, right? Uh, so I still think there's room to wiggle here, right? There are temporal exceptions, not in principle ones. Even though
Hmm.
you're right, I think that some people are going to be so far down the priority, like people who commit genocides, for example, that they'll practically, in all practicality, they'll probably never be reached, right? Um, but they're still not in principle exceptions,
Well, you
and
could
it's
also make the
yeah,
case that they actually do deserve priority because if you want, so like the first poster that or the first internet argument we saw, if you want to understand the why, like why does someone do a certain thing, like maybe people who are abusers or
Hmm.
are committing atrocities, like maybe they should be up on our priority, because if we want to avoid something like that happening again, we need to understand why it happened in the first place.
Right.
um, which in some way seems a little like gross, because you would think that it's better to empathize with the victims, the people who are suffering, rather than the perpetrators of atrocities. But maybe
Right.
the understanding like could take precedence there,
Yeah,
typically.
there's an argument to be made there. I think one way of building off of that is to suggest that this project of empathy, especially for the sake of like understanding or learning why these kinds of atrocities are committed or whatever, uh, should be thought of as a distributed project rather than an individual one, right? So it's not the case that you, all of you, and I individually are on the hook for having empathy for all people at all times. This, I don't think anyone thinks is possible, right?
Hmm.
Um, but when we're talking about whether or not everyone is worthy of empathy or something like that. Okay, should we have empathy for everyone? The idea could be just that everyone should have empathy somewhere, right? You should have empathy for some people and be open to empathy to all, right? But other people are going to do that work for you, right? So
Hmm.
I don't have to be empathetic to every single murderer out there in order to figure out why they did what they did, right? But there is someone who could do that work, right? We can divide the labor, right? We can divide the labor. And that way it will become somehow, I think, less crushing, right? Um, Still, uh, there
Yeah.
are
So
like studies that show people who are involved with being exposed to these kinds of crimes uh, routinely, their mental health is not the best, so to put it simply, right? So it
mm,
offloading the burden to other people, while it might still preserve an answer to the question, should we be empathetic to everyone, might still preserve the possibility of saying yes, right? Because we can offload it, might still have problems, right? There might still be problems there.
right. And then there's the issue. The in the first post we went over, the first commenter seemed to suggest that empathizing with people who do bad things is somehow like that is bad, perhaps
Hmm.
because you're like sort of taking away, you're diminishing. I don't know, they didn't make this case exactly, but some people may say that you're diminishing their responsibility. You're taking away something from the terribleness of whatever they committed, um, by empathizing with it, by trying to understand them. Um,
Right.
so that might be another way to land on the no camp for why we should have empathy for
Sure.
everyone. I don't know if I buy that argument
Well,
necessarily.
that leads immediately into the second point that this person makes. So let's read that now.
Okay.
They say sometimes empathy is also misplaced or questionably relevant and downplays their action being the actions of people who have done wrong. Like when people go, "Aw, Ted Bundy probably felt really bad when his girlfriend dumped him for having no ambition. His dislike for women might have stemmed from that." Because it isn't really relevant. Maybe he did feel bad, but his reaction is so overblown that by extending that empathy, we're extending some normalization and rationalizing an irrational reaction. So, uh, very similar to what you were suggesting, by extending empathy to cases like this, we might be downplaying the severity of what is done. And
Hmm.
worse, what this person is suggesting, uh, starting to normalize the behavior. If I'm going around putting myself in the shoes of the people who have committed these kind of grave offenses, well, then it might start to feel normal to me. It might lose the uh, like important moral valence that it had before, right? Like, no, this is shocking. This is terrible. Uh, we ought not to lose that. And so, if empathy might cause us to, then maybe empathy's not for the best, at least in all cases.
Right. Yeah, I think this is another example where you can kind of get uh, like the you kind of get paralyzed. So you can get paralyzed by empathy by like being overwhelmed by the emotions, but you could potentially get paralyzed by it too by just saying, like, well, I can kind of see why everybody does everything. So like, why should I care that this guy murdered this other guy? Or like, it
Mm-hmm.
kind of leads to this apathy, um, which I think that's interesting. But I think the examples that they used with the Ted Bunny is maybe a little disingenuous because I don't think anyone's saying that because Ted Bunny's girlfriend dumped him, like that's why he killed
Mm-hmm.
um, all these women. There was something clearly wrong with him. Like even if we don't know exactly what caused it, like
Right.
it's not a normal thing to do. Like someone who has a girlfriend dump them, it doesn't cause that sort of behavior. So I mean, I think um, so. Like it's a more extreme series of events that caused his behavior.
Well, that's what
So
they're
yeah,
suggesting,
yeah.
is that what he did as a response to whatever happened to him, um, is not okay, right? But if we try to put ourselves in his shoes, we might allow ourselves to be at least temporarily lured into thinking, like, oh, I understand why he did this.
Mm-hmm.
No, no, what he did was not a rational reaction, right? It was way out of line, right? So, um, yeah,
Right. So with that reasoning, it might be best to kind of just think of these sort of people like the Ted Bundys or the Hitlers or whatever as just monsters, like just in this class sort of by themselves, and not
mm,
like a person who had some things happen to them. Like it's better to think of them as this horrible entity that you shouldn't even try to really understand, at least not emotionally, like
right,
maybe like forensically for the
sure.
the good of preventing it in the future, but not getting
This
too
brings to
deep into
mind
that.
like the conversation that unfortunately we continue to have about school shootings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where um, there are some camps that want to say, well, we can. It's terrible. They should not have done it, but we can empathize. We can understand why they did it. They were the subject of like bullying and ridicule, et cetera, et cetera. It's not clear, of course, that in each case that was true for
Mm-hmm.
these people, but nevertheless, it's a move that people make, right? And then others respond to that saying, no, it is wrong to try to empathize with this person in this way for exactly the same reasons we more or less just heard, right? That you do
Mm-hmm.
not want to normalize this kind of reaction to things like bullying or whatever. This reaction is not acceptable. It's far overblown, right? Don't normalize this reaction to those kind of feelings. Um, so it's a conversation that we're seeing play out all the time, practically.
Right. Well, I think it's been a little over an hour. It'd be a good time to wrap up. So, on the question of should we have empathy for everyone, um, I think it's a little easier to make the case with that with like cognitive empathy. So, just trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes to understand them. So, like, I mean, that could be good even for the Hitlers of the world. Like, just for practical purposes to try to prevent such things
To
from
stop it
happening
from
again with a
happening
school
again,
shooting, right?
right?
Um, Emotional empathy, I think it gets a little more complicated.
It's a bit more
Um,
dicey. Yeah.
right.
It might be the case that emotional empathy sort of allows us to appreciate the salience of some morally valence thing, right? Like to actually put yourself in the shoes of someone else, to feel as they do, might be necessary to fully comprehend their experience, especially if you aren't, if your lived experience is far removed from theirs, right? As in the case of like affluent whites, when the lynchings are occurring in Mississippi, right?
Right.
When Emmett Till's casket or his funeral's open casket, right? Um, when your lived experience is so far removed, it might be impossible for you to fully appreciate uh, the importance of the problem if you can't find a way to empathize in this way. But at the same time, we also saw some reasons for thinking that embracing this kind of felt empathy, this emotional empathy, right? Uh, you might be doing something harmful as well, right? You could either do some kind of harm to yourself, right? There's only so much that you personally can take on. You might be doing harm to others. Like, for instance, you might be uh, jeopardizing the status of a victim, right? If you're overly empathetic with an abuser, perhaps you're failing them in some way. And there's some other reasons,
Right. And maybe there's a way you can have the right kind of empathetic response. Maybe you can train yourself to
right?
have, like an emotional empathy that's has all the benefits that we talked about, but not so much the detriment. So you better understand people, but not so much that it can kind of lead you to these more morally questionable areas. And I don't know if that's possible, but yeah.
Right.
So
I think a further complication that we didn't really have time to hit on comes in when if you do decide, no, not everyone is worthy of empathy, or no, I don't have to give empathy to all. Uh, how are you going to decide who's worthy and who isn't? Right?
mhm.
Who gets to count and who doesn't? Right? It's going to be tricky to define a standard. Anyone who's done anything wrong, and we've all done things that are considered wrong by some standard, right? So you'd be throwing everyone out. If you want to throw out people like uh, drug addicts, right? There's going to be pushback, like from us, right? As we saw earlier in the episode. Seems like maybe that's too far. Murderers, I don't know, right? It's going to become difficult to figure out exactly where you should draw the line. It seems pretty clear that like the Hitlers of the world are probably far less deserving, but
Mm,
they're not all going to be so clear cut, right? They're not always
right.
going to be so clear cut.
Yeah. Some murderers had everything against them, like just growing up where they grew up in their environment. Like
Mm-hmm.
they basically had. It's hard to imagine anything else coming out of that. So
Right.
they're a better candidate than other types of murderers for sure.
All right. So what's the conclusion, Lewis?
Uh,
What's the answer?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Well, I would say cognitive empathy, yes. Emotional empathy,
Right.
that's where I would land on that.
Right. Okay. Sure. So we more or less end where we always do. Um. Perhaps.
Yeah, we didn't
Perhaps.
solve the issue, not this time.
Yeah. Not this time. All right. Well, maybe we'll have better luck when we tackle whatever the next issue is.
All right.
But until then,
Yeah.
see you
We'll see
next
you next
time.
time.